for the proposal to be accepted. So kind of all of the background info that we really need to have this conversation.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions, but yeah. So I think I'll start with what system chains are, and then get into Statemint specifically, and then a little bit about this roadmap. So system chains are really just a way of putting core Polkadot functionality into parachains, right? So like, 5 years ago, like what you worked on, Rob, with like kind of the proposal for what Polkadot should be, is like this amazing scalability platform where by parallelizing transactions, we can actually support a lot more transactions than you could just in a single chain. So the relay chain is really meant to be this consensus provider to all the parachains and then that are like within its network. And so, but the relay chain also has all these other kind of subsystems within it, like staking, governance, balances, auctions, crowd loans, all this other stuff. And so we can actually just use the Polkadot scalability protocol that allows parallelization of transactions for the Polkadot protocol itself. So it's basically just moving the Polkadot protocol into parachains instead of the relay chain. So system chains are really like, it's more of an architectural thing than anything, right? Like, so then the question is like, well, what becomes a system chain versus what doesn't? And the kind of simple answer is that it has to be voted in by governance. So I think it's like a root origin requirement that like if you want to add a parachain, you need root origin, right? And there's two ways that you can kind of access that origin for that specific call. If you want to register a parachain, or not register a parachain, but obtain a lease for a parachain. And so one of those ways is to just use the root origin directly via a governance proposal or referendum. And the other way is to win an auction, right? Like if you actually look at the code for parachain auctions, at the end of the auction, it just takes the winner and gives them a root origin call to give that parachain some lease. So that's like kind of how we decide like what is a system parachain is just via a governance referendum that says, okay, instead of using an auction, we're going to use this other mechanism, governance, in order to register or in order to give a lease to this parachain. And so like there's a broader like system parachain roadmap with like the collectives parachain that just launched and the bridge hub that is, if you check the Cumulus repo, you'll see a pretty big PR was just merged with a bridge hub runtime for Kusama. So I think there'll be a proposal pretty soon on that. But yeah, this today is mostly focused on Statemint. So Statemint is an assets parachain, and it kind of started out as like, so I guess like it has fungible and non-fungible assets, and it actually has some like a pretty nice non-fungible asset roadmap. But I think today's conversation is going to be focused more on the fungible side. And so this kind of first came out like about a year ago, maybe like a year and a half ago on Kusama. And the assets that it was focused on were mostly something that somebody would want to like go and deploy, right? So like if you have like a reserve-backed stablecoin like USDT or USDC, those aren't like protocol-based tokens. They're almost like, I would call them like trust-backed assets, right? Like some issuer goes and registers a token, and they put some supply on it, and they let you transfer it, and they kind of tell you like, hey, we have like a one-to-one correspondence of off-chain assets for all these assets that are on-chain, and you're kind of trusting them. That's what like gives the token value, at least to a user, is that you trust that the person who's issued that token actually has that one-to-one backing for it. And that was kind of like the first year of Statemint was like it kind of supported like anybody could come in and like register an asset, and it gave an API that was very similar to ERC20 to actually go and use it. And what we're kind of looking at now is the future of Statemint and how this can be more useful, not just for these assets that somebody wants to register, kind of based on the trust of the person registering it, but also like we have all these other tokens in the Polkadot ecosystem, like the Parachain native tokens that are actually backed by protocols and not by like trust in some issuer. And so I wrote up a post on the forum about a lot of stuff that we can do, including a DEX that will make Statemint a lot more useful for these other tokens, but also make those other tokens a lot more useful on Statemint itself for things like paying transaction fees and giving a bit more flexibility in how we are able to execute transactions on Statements. So yeah, I think that's the background of this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. So we have a proposal for a DEX to be added to Statement, and I'm going to throw this over to you, Lucas, based on the comments that you've made on the forum. But what sort of capabilities do you see that unlocking for the ecosystem as a whole? You know, do you see it as a strong case for the DEX?
So, I mean, maybe to start out with, right? Like, I think I can't claim actually credit for the idea that every parachain should have a DEX, but I do think it makes a lot of sense, and that's why I kind of said why I support this. I don't know who initially came up with or who initially made this proposal. It definitely was one of the parity folks. I think so. So when you think of what you can do with XCM, it's you can do a lot, but it's always asynchronous, right? And so when it's asynchronous, you add a ton of complexity or you add a lot of risk. And that is something where if you have a native DEX, you can just completely get rid of that. So as an example, right, like if I want to pay transaction fees in some token with absolutely zero liquidity that can be easily manipulated on any DEX, like why as a parachain, like either I accept it and I take the risk that by the time I'm swapping it with XCM to some other chain, I have a huge price risk, or I try to come up with some other mechanisms to kind of like maybe have like fees prepaid and someone else will do this. This is a solution that basically prepaid, basically people contribute to like a fee pool, and that was the solution Brian Chen and suppose and that Akala is using. But in the end, like all of these designs like invariably end up looking very much like a DEX, which gives you what you want, which is that a parachain, right, can like natively atomically swap within a transaction or token. And so I think that's like the main thing that I like in this, because it actually reduces a whole lot of complexity that I have to think about as a parachain builder of like, oh, like how do I integrate with these other parachains? For example, right, in Centrifuge, like one thing we're doing is we're integrating through XCM with Moonbeam. And for that, we need to buy tokens to be able to pay for gas. So how do we do that? Well, like we can, of course, do that through XCM and find a way that all of this happens. But there's, of course, if the price is hugely volatile, like it's extremely easy to kind of like arbitrage, or is a nice word, or exploit is a bad word, like any of these price variances, right? And try to like actually get the parachain to a point where like it might not be operating at a profit, and you could do certain transactions that cost the parachain more than the users paid for. And that's just always like scary and dangerous. And that's why I like the idea of a DEX. The other reason that I like it is that, like, for example, as a parachain, like you want to be able to just very easily buy like other tokens to pay for your lease. That's not as much of a use case for Statement and maybe the topic today, right? But I think in general, as a parachain, I would love to have a native DEX that I can just use to buy more DOT. Like say, as an example, right? Like put like a % of every transaction fee that that happens on chain, and just take that and do a swap every block, right, for DOT. And that's how, like, for example, the treasury could buy DOT to pay for the slot. So those are the use cases that I think of when I think of like a DEX and Statement, and by extension also DEX for other parachains. Now, this isn't going to compete with like a very specialized, high liquidity, like maybe even like very innovative, like cutting edge DEX that other parachains are building, where like maybe it is really built for active trading. But if you even have a small DEX, right, like someone will be able to arbit and provide liquidity, and kind of like will provide a risk-free way for anyone to interact with it.
Yeah, that's definitely a topic I want to get into in this call, sort of what avenues remain to specialize for DEX projects. But before we get into that, I'm going to send something over to you, Derek. Some of the strongest criticism of the proposal has come out of the Moonbeam community. What's your general feeling on the drivers behind that?
Yeah, I have had, as I mentioned, have gotten a lot of feedback on this point. So I have a few thoughts on it. But one, I would just start with maybe kind of more of the less technical, more of the emotional kind of lens, which is, I think a lot of the folks that are building in the ecosystem here, not just in Moonbeam, but whether they could also be DeFi parachains that have DEX functionality on them. I feel like it's bear market, not the easiest time. There's kind of a scratching out existence. Protocol revenues are down, and so I think people are kind of obviously kind of hunkered down and trying to figure out how they can kind of pay for things. And then there's just I think people seeing something like this, there's a kind of an immediate visceral reaction of like, oh well, geez, is this am I now competing against the state, basically? And is there? I think a lot of folks kind of have this, have a mental model, which we can perhaps discuss also as a separate point, which is that the key is like liquidity, and liquidity is like a zero-sum game, and so thus, if there are other offerings which are going to attract a lot of the liquidity, then that's less liquidity for the protocol they're working on. That means that their protocol works less efficiently and has like a less valuable service, and that means like reduced like protocol revenues, which then tie into the whole kind of how how people are trying to think about sustainability and trying to pay for just operational expenses like these days. So I think that that's kind of the context, I'd say, or like kind of the immediate reaction before getting into the details. I think the thing I would like to drill in on as part of the upfront discussion here is just kind of what the goals are, because I have heard different things like from different people in explaining kind of what the goals of the DEX-like functionality on Statemint is. There's one family of use cases around kind of making onboarding easier, right, and making it easier to kind of move in and out of different, like let's say parachain base tokens. But then there's use cases like the treasury might have large dot trades they want to do for stables, and I feel like some of these things are a bit different and have like different kinds of requirements, and there seems to be a bit of maybe either confusion or lack of clarity on what goals or non-goals might be for the project, which I think is leading to some of the disagreements. So yeah, just a few thoughts. I almost want to put that over to Joe. I'm also conscious that Jacob actually joins. I don't know that he got a chance to introduce himself, so I also want to give Jacob a chance to introduce himself too, if he's going to be answering questions as well.
Of course.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm sorry for missing the introductions. I'm Jacob. I'm DeFi enthusiast pretty much from 2018, which leads to my passion to build DEX which can actually challenge centralized exchanges. And we were always considering, based on like deep research of all other technology, Polkadot and Substrate as a best stack to achieve this like grand vision for this. So I co-founded with other folks Hydra DX and Basilisk.
Yeah, sorry for missing you earlier, Jakob. Thanks for the intro now. Yeah, based on your comments, Derek, I would like to kick it over to Joe just briefly to summarize the goals, and then I do have some questions for Jakob as well.
Yeah, sure. So I would give it two primary goals with maybe a third goal that we can tack on to the end of it. So the first goal is definitely, like Derek mentioned, like some big, like highly liquid dot to stable or like external pairs, right? So like you kind of imagine like say dot to some stable, dot ETH, dot Bitcoin, dot KSM, right? Like I think as far as like obtaining liquidity, like those are the ones that we'd want to be like more usable from the treasury perspective, right? And then and of course, like I think that's also where there is a little bit more room asynchronously, where like, okay, does this order actually need to happen on Statemint, or can it be divided up into some other into some like other dexes on other parachains, right? Like I think that's definitely part of the solution of like what the treasury could be doing. And then the second one is just kind of like going into the sufficient assets and fee payments. Although I know like Rob, in your agenda, you have a question about like, can we just make everything sufficient as long as you can pay fees with it? I wouldn't quite say it that way, but I think I would change the role of what sufficient assets actually do, right? Because now being a sufficient asset kind of lumps a couple different functionalities together. One is that you could actually like create an account on chain that has some like some storage space on chain based on this asset. And the other is that you can pay fees on the asset. And I still think that like we might want to be careful about calling an asset sufficient when we're going to let that asset issuer send out that asset and take up, some amount of state in the state tree. But I think we can change the role of sufficiency to be more focused on just that, and then just say like, well, okay, as long as you can, if you're making a transaction, as long as you can provide a route from some token to DOT, because we want the collators to be able to accept DOT as their fee payment. As long as you can give us something that can be converted to DOT synchronously, then you can pay fees with that, and you don't need to have DOT in your account in order to transact, or in order to use some application. So I think that's those are like the two primary goals. And then when it comes to like other goals, like it was discussed in that forum thread about like having some avenues between DOT and other parachain tokens. And I think that really comes down to like how people want to use that. So this DEX would definitely be like permissionless, right? Like there's not going to be some hard-coded cap about like how much liquidity can be on a pair, or like who can create pairs, who can't. So like you could kind of imagine, well, like some new entrant is having trouble maybe getting listed on a centralized exchange or something, and they want to use the Statemint DEX in order to provide an avenue from DOT to their Parachain token, or some other Parachain might say, yeah, we have a lot of avenues for people to obtain our token. We're not really going to worry about the DOT pair that we have on Statemint. So it's something there that people can use, but like, of course, they don't have to.
Yeah, if I can jump in, that's interesting, because there are these different kind of I guess there are different use cases, I guess, in my mind. And the route to get from DOT to other Parachain tokens. I'd heard like this when I was reviewing the forum post earlier. There was this term that was being thrown around, like a gas station, right? So like there's kind of this concept. I think that hits at maybe the fee payments, and maybe even like the route from getting from onboarding into DOT, but then getting into like a Parachain token as part of like a user experience flow. I mean, my sense is that those are potentially like less. Those are less concerning to people that are operating other DeFi protocols like in the ecosystem. But it's like the first one that was mentioned, kind of building deep liquidity in key pairs. That goes back to this, let's call it like this concern, or like if in the mental model where liquidity is a zero-sum game, and then there's going to be deep liquidity developed like for certain pairs here. I think that's probably the scenario that seems to be the thing that raises the most concern, because then it's like, okay, like how does that get done? Is that like then is there incentive programs or something being put to attract like liquidity from LPs like into those pools, and is it zero sum where that'll drain liquidity out of like the parachains basically like into those pools, this kind of thing?
Yeah, so I have like two responses to that. One is that and this goes kind of into like parachain specialization, and what Polkadot is actually really good at is like that people can specialize in different types of things. So I'm going to cautiously mention this, but I don't want this conversation to dive into like implementation detail arguments. But like one of the things that we've discussed is only allowing pairs where DOT is one of the pairs. So this actually goes to like more of like a Uniswap v1 style than like Uniswap v2 that I initially wrote in the forum post. And that's because like the primary use on those pairs is like some avenue for like some token to pay fees in DOT, or to have some avenue between like the treasury and DOT and some other thing like a stable or Ether or KSM. So and I know like I've talked with like Lucas and some other people about all these other like, well, okay, well that's not good for stable pairs. It's like, well, okay, that's fine. Like that's not what we're designing for. And so I think for like a lot of these other pairs, this is exactly where parachain specialization comes in. Like absolutely right. Like Uniswap v1 is not optimized for front running protection or or stable to stable type of pairs, but like that's not what we're trying to build. Like that's not the utility of a DEX on Statement. And the second part would be about like the liquidity being a zero-sum game, which I understand in a smaller context, but I think we have to look outside of just like a walled garden of like a single network. I mean, you could kind of compare it to like hiring and Web3 developers, right? Like you say, oh, there's 10,000 developers. You know, if I get one, then you don't. But like you look at the pool of software developers and that's, hundreds of thousands or millions, and like we shouldn't be fighting with each other over like a small pond. We should be trying to bring more of this into the ecosystem in total.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to kick it over to Jakob. What's your perspective on this as a parachain building a highly specialized DEX? And do you share those same concerns about liquidity, or what other concerns might you have?
Actually, like our concerns aren't around liquidity. Like our concerns are more like human centric. Like from our story, how we started, there at least used to be some kind of like loose social contract that Polkadot is providing, as also Joe and others mentioned, like platform for like blockchains which are like highly specialized in their use cases. And now we are getting to the like discussions like if Polkadot should implement some of the feature which is common for almost all DeFi parachains which are trying to master this use case and this feature, or is like very practical for them to have it. And like based on like my history of like building communities and like contributing to communities, people are extremely tribal. That's one thing. So they are like super protective about their holdings, and you could already see it on like when this idea was like initiated. Like I'm not sure like how many of bots they were included or not, but what I was like a little bit surprised was like people who like feel like much more affiliated to Dot as an asset and as a community, and like Dot community is basically much bigger than all other parachains communities, because like parachain communities are usually just subset of Dot community. Then these like people were like very bullish on this idea just for the like very simple reason. This is like basically enhancing and improving the feature set of the Polkadot, and they don't care about like if it's like making life of other DEX parachains which are specializing on it easier or harder, because like certainly can have potential to improve a Polkadot itself. So this was like one other thing, and the second is thing like in like our society, I think it's like everybody see how people has like super short attention span, and like everybody needs to fight over the mind share, and it's like even in like within the Dotsama there is like pretty, what we see is like pretty strong sometimes dog fights over the liquidity and over the community members, which like isn't our goal, but it's like happening. And like imagine that people start to compare you with basically the Statemint DEX, and then like people will be like naturally comparing Statemint DEX to all other DEXs, and like it will be like super messy and hairy discussion and super noisy. Like people won't listen. They like use like people are like basically gravitating usually to like very fast conclusions, to a lot of like, and is like usually very harder to debunk the food than it's like ease of creation of it. So what I actually fear personally is like it can like create a lot of confusion, not just within the community but also outside of community, and it like we should actually like reduce the narratives of Polkadot and its like strength, and like unique features, rather than like going in the opposite way and like add more features and make the protocol more complex, because it's like already one of the most complex, if not most complex and most advanced tech. So people already have like hard times to understand and the whole like ecosystem and relay chain and like parachains and all our like unique features, and they have like hard times to wrap their head around it, which is like causing a lot of like communication issues. And just imagine that we will add there like much more complexity here, and like all the operational baggage like connected to it, and all like management baggage. So like
So I disagree about this because like there's a bunch of stuff on Statement that's actually complex because there's not a DEX. So all of the stuff about like, well, we need to have a governance proposal in order to make an asset sufficient because we need to be able to trust the issuer. All this fee payment stuff, like we have this like really hacky solution about just the ratio of minimum balances. This obviously goes out of sync about what they should be. It results in like a really bad user experience, a really bad integration experience. All of this stuff kind of like disappears when you have a DEX, and it's really like I don't know. It's just kind of funny because like the proposal is not like more complex. Like it's actually like a very well understood protocol, and like I don't think that adding like a very well understood like Uniswap v1 style DEX should really impact like anybody else's ability to clearly state their value proposition of what they're working on.
I was not challenging the implementation part of it, or like technical implementation, but actually also as it is like very well researched and understood protocol, it also like having a lot of other trade-offs which other people will be gaming. Basically, like DeFi and everything around permissionless liquidity is the most adversarial space out there. So it's not that easy. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I think the fact that products might get compared to the Statemint DEX, and then there's of course the broader issue that's been raised of where should something end up in common good or in a system chain, and when shouldn't something? I wonder if there are some general principles, Joe, that you kind of landed on to guide that for the proposals that you make now or in the future.
Yeah, I wrote kind of a long forum post a few months ago on pretty much this topic, and I should probably revisited it before this, just to have a bit more clarity about that. But like, yeah, so ultimately, I think that having something in a system chain is saying this is part of the Polkadot protocol, right? And there's a pretty big opinionation spectrum on like where do you draw the line. And so I think on some stuff that's like there's some stuff that's very core, like staking and parachain execution core allocation, right? Like because there can only be one solution to it, right? You can't have, let's say you have like account ID 1, it can't be a validator and not a validator according to the staking system. You can't have like Parachain 3000 be a parachain and not be a parachain at the same time, right? So you need to have like one canonical system to say this is what this state looks like right now. But then you can move out a little bit, like so on stuff like say auctions, right? Like you need one auction system to allocate these parachain slots, or like the parachain leases. Well, okay, a crowd loan is one way to participate in an auction, but there's also lots of other ways that people could combine their funds and participate in an auction as a collective. So when we, like Polkadot in the relay chain now, it provides this crowd loan functionality as a default. And so you could kind of say, well, you know what, we should just remove crowd loans entirely from Polkadot and let other people develop that and just say this should not be part of this system. Or people say, well, a lot of those things don't exist, so it should be part of the system so that people who don't have enough DOT to bid an auction themselves, they can collaborate and do this together. And having the crowd loan implementation as like part of the Polkadot protocol, that doesn't prevent other collaboration protocols from emerging and showing up. It's just kind of like the default option, if you will. And so as we kind of like move into like more stuff like bounties for the using the treasury, and then same with like assets, like do we go beyond DOT and like do we even add an assets palette so that people can register like trust-backed assets at all, right? Like these are all kind of things that like move a little bit farther out on opinionation, but yeah, eventually like every decision kind of comes down to governance and whether or not it will be accepted.
I kind of want to chime in on this because I think that this does cut at the core of the underlying, the underlying rub here, which is this kind of like what is part of the core protocol, what is left up to parachain teams or dApp builders to build. And I do feel like there is maybe some philosophical differences in people taking different positions on this point. Where so take Moonbeam, obviously, like that's what I'm closest to. Where we do have there is staking functionality in Moonbeam that is part of the core protocol, but in general, like any kind of like DeFi functionality is not something we would ever, that I don't see that as like being like something that would make sense philosophically, like in the Moonbeam protocol, and that would be competing against like a lot of the people in that are deployed into the EVM. On the other side, I'm thinking, Rob, you and I were kind of talking about this the other day in a slightly different but similar context. There's kind of this mindset of, well, there are certain like services that maybe are public goods that should be provided like in the core protocol itself. So I think the joke that we were joking about, Rob, was that there's kind of this like American versus European mindset, right? Where the American in me is like, well, just let like a lot of these things, let the market figure it out, like let it be like commercially driven. Whereas I find even on my own team that like the Europeans tend to have like a little bit of a different view, where they're like, well, there's certain things that maybe should be like provided as like a baseline service. But I do think there is something about that like philosophical stance of like what it is that should be in the core protocol or not that's at stake here. And I think just one of my fears is just from working, when you work on anything, there's like this feature creep thing that happens, right? So I think, in fact, the Statemint DEX itself is probably feature creep in a way that was not contemplated when the original vision of Statemint as just an asset issuance kind of chain was contemplated. And then you get into the this DEX, and I can tell you even from just looking at the teams on Moonbeam that a regular XYK implementation these days is not really all that competitive. I mean, I think we looked, there was like this large trade that was being considered that were, I think the team wanted to be paid in stables. It was like 2 some odd million, right, to the Snow Fork team. But in order to do like a 2 some odd million DOT trade for stables on an XYK implementation, you need like hundreds of millions of liquidity, like in the pool, to have that be at all efficient. So then it's like, okay, then we got to build liquidity, or then we need concentrated liquidity features. And I feel like there's probably going to be a lot of like user complaints and pull that will pull like towards like these more advanced features, or TWAMs, like the frac swap system on Moonbeam has these TWAMs where you can put in like large orders that get filled over some like longer period of time. And so I think that's you're gonna I think, Joe, you'll probably be faced with a lot of these like user complaints and other things as people are trying to use a system, and there's going to be this like might be an irresistible urge to then go try to act and continue to build other things, multi-sig, who knows, right? Other features that are needed to like how satisfy those complaints.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Derek, and we have talked about this a bunch in the past. I'm going to step out of the moderator shoes for a moment and go onto the soapbox briefly. And I think the most important thing to me anyway is that the incentives for builders are right. When you have entrepreneurial people, it's important for them to be able to feel like they're able to engage in an arena where they have potentially unlimited upside if they do their job right. And I think it's very important to create an environment where it's clear that there are opportunities, and even when things can be added to the core, it's definitely a difficult question of, is this something that can be also furthered by the free market and by competition, even if it's not as tightly integrated into DOT, maybe that means that the pie is growing overall, and that means that it's still net beneficial for DOT and potentially more net beneficial. I think that there's a certain permanency to stuff being added by governance, and that it's kind of hard to get rid of, even if alternative solutions might emerge when they're enshrined. And this is definitely a qualitative question. I think a lot of this circles back to Lucas's point that he made in the very beginning about essentially runtime composability, and the fact that maybe every parachain might need to have a DEX, that every parachain might need to specialize not just on features, but on the composition of those features, or the particular aspects and implementations of those features. So I think that might be helpful in framing the discussion about sort of maybe general principles of what would be good to have in the community, as well as some of the qualitative aspects that are driving the arguments both for and against the DEX. And Lucas, Joe, why don't you pick it up and then send it over to Lucas?
Yeah, I will send it to Lucas. I think that's actually, I should have included that in like when you asked me about what becomes a system chain and what doesn't, because I think that's a really important part. And also like what Derek said about feature creep, and they are related. So like about a little over a year ago, like we were actually discussing like should statements have a DEX, and I had kind of originally started on the yes side of that, and through a lot of conversations with people in the ecosystem, and actually like one with Lucas, kind of decided like, no, actually we shouldn't, because exactly like Derek said, like, okay, well, this is something that will kind of like be sorted out in the ecosystem. And we've had like a number of things come up that say like, well, okay, we have this problem and a DEX would fix it. And now we have a list of like, 4 or 5 things where just like, if we have a DEX, all of these things that are kind of like either overly conservative from a security point of view, like asset sufficiency, or just like these hacky solutions, like the minimum balance conversion between assets, like a DEX makes all of this stuff like magically go away. But I do think like we should have some kind of like path of like for something to like be phased out of being part of the Polkadot system. Like I could imagine like if we go back to crowd loans, right? Like if there end up being like 10 different market-based crowd loan solutions, why not remove the default Polkadot crowd loan palette, right? Like why does that even need to be there at a certain point? And I think like from a lot of discussions I've had over the last like 6 months, not having a DEX on statement has been hurting a lot of use cases. And so I think it's valuable to have one now, but that doesn't mean it can't eventually be replaced and phased out. And I think we've seen some like alternate proposals of teams saying like, well, okay, I started this parachain, but I want it to become part of the Polkadot system eventually. And this is like, there was like a really old, I think like CoinDesk article by Gav about like chain mergers and acquisitions, right? And like, I think we could totally imagine system level stuff being phased out like, eventually, or spun out into something that has its own token, or something that is like from the ecosystem that could actually be like acquired by the Polkadot treasury and like turned into part of the Polkadot system. So yeah, I think that's like actually an important part that should be part of the discussion of like, is there a way to eventually phase out the Statemint DEX if there becomes a better solution across the ecosystem? I think Lucas was supposed to be next, but I see Jakob put his hand up, so I'll let you guys fight it out over who goes.
Go ahead, Jakob.
Thank you so much. Like, we also fear that like when you are holding a hammer, everything looks like nail, and like maybe, and there was already, I think it was mentioned by Brian and our Jakub, our CTO. He's also Jakub. Sorry for the confusion. That maybe there might be like more elegant solutions than like building DEX and and then have the like necessity to solve every potential issue and all the issues related to it. Like for example, like if you really care about like UX and ease of paying fees, like we can do it like maybe easier via oracles, but for that we would need like working storage proof solution, and maybe then like it can boils down like let's let's list nice grant from the Polkadot Treasury or Web3 Foundation for like developing this, either by parity or either by a collection of people from other parachains or some like outside company, and we don't, and like it would be like great working solution which would improve UX dramatically without need to building another DEX and like then like having all the issues related to it from the like operational and management and also like communication point of view. Or like we can think about it even like more practically and say like, okay, like who are our potential users and from where they will be coming. So like most common assets in crypto are Bitcoin and ETH. So people coming from Bitcoin, what about making inter BTC and maybe wrap Bitcoin sufficient? I think Interlay is using Oracle palette or like Oracle feed or Bitcoin price feed already for like tracking Bitcoin price from like a couple of centralized exchanges, and you would support Interlay as a Bitcoin bridge, and you would also support people coming via Interlay with the most common crypto asset ever and out there or so far, which is Bitcoin. And similarly with ETH, like we will hopefully we will have soon Snowfork, and then like we can even like hard code it like some like like very beneficial price or like very defensible price in like current crypto volatility, something like ETH for $500 or something like that, and Polkadot would be charging fees in Ethereum in that price, so it would be like harder to DDoS even if like ETH will drop a lot, and you can onboard like millions of people holding ETH and bridging from ETH ecosystem to Dotsama, and like it might be enough. So I think we should maybe explore more like other and potentially more elegant solutions with less trade-offs.
Yeah, so maybe to go back to what Joe said, that conversation that we had, I was actually on the other side of the argument. I was saying Statemint shouldn't have a DEX. And the argument I made back then was, and that argument I think is still valid, like why should Statemint build a DEX? Why not like just have every parachain compete for selling at the best price? And I actually like spent quite a bit of time thinking about how you could have a parachain trade. Or like ask for a trade and have anyone be able to settle it. Very quickly you end up designing something like an order book exchange or RFQ system or stuff that is definitely equally complicated. And so then like, okay, maybe a DEX and an AMM is still the right solution after all. I mean, but the one thing though I do want to say is, right, like all these questions about DEXs and sufficiency and whatnot in Statemint, it just comes from the fact that we think, oh, like we can't ask users to hold DOT when they also want to hold an ERC20 token. But the reality is that like everyone that bridges Bitcoin through REN BTC or wrap BTC over to Ethereum, the first thing they need to do is they need to somehow buy ETH so that they'll be able to transact, right? So like maybe this, not derailing the discussion too much, but maybe actually a different decision could have been, oh, like why do we actually have sufficiency at all? We just require everyone to have some DOT on Statemint so that they can have balances of other tokens on Statemint. And that's like a question that I wanted to bring up here, or like maybe a different solution where like the challenges that we see today, like I know, like I remember in 2017 and 18, I used to complain to people all the time, like saying, well, it's so hard to like start using any of these products because, well, you tell people, oh, you want to buy the token? Sure, you have to buy the token, but then you also need to buy ETH, right? And that was like the hurdle somehow, I think, in the Ethereum ecosystem. Like people got past that. They know they need optimism. They know they need Matic. They know they need ETH to interact with the network, and maybe that's actually just a totally fine solution for Statemint as well.
By the way, one of the main reasons why we also choose Substrate was like having an ability to allow people to pay in fees in more common assets. So, for example, when we launched Basilisk, we from the first day or from the first block, it was able to pay fees on Basilisk with KSM and AUSD, and most of the people coming to us to Basilisk, they were basically like Kusama community already holding KSM, so so they were paying fees happily with KSM because it was their like most common asset for them already. So I think we can like a little bit inspire from this, and similarly as I mentioned before, like if we want to attract more people outside of, I don't know, even like Cosmos ecosystem where the biggest denominator is Atom, and we want to like also like improve or increase the network effects of Dotsama, let's happily accept Atom as a fee asset with maybe a little bit worse price against DOT. So you are also like incentivizing people to use DOT as a fee asset. But on the other hand, like if they will come from the other ecosystem or maybe Matic, whatever, that they can still like look around, they can come elegantly, they can look around in like parachain protocols, try it, and then maybe decide if they want to buy DOT and pay fees in DOT or other stuff. So I think it's like it could be really much more like simple solution to this.
Yeah, but this is like exactly. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to chime in that like it's clear that having like an integral DEX like in your protocol gives you all this like optionality, right? I know Akala and other folks are also doing this where you can accept different fee payments. I feel like for me, it's the key thing though is around this proposed DEX being part of the core, and I kind of played out this way, right? That there's certain kind of equilibrium points when you have systems like this, and so what are like the bad scenarios that we need to like guard against, like on an idea like this? And I feel like there is some, degenerate kind of runaway world where like liquidity is kind of like, because I saw some people commenting like, well, Polkadot quote doesn't have a DEX or doesn't have like a trusted DEX, which, I think that's the thing that kind of gets ecosystem teams a little bit, upset. But, let's say that maybe from an outsider point of view, having it in the core is somehow different. The runaway scenario that I think would be bad would be that, people with DOT like basically target that as like the primary place where they're going to LP, not into the parachains. So then like liquidity gets like drained out of like the parachains. And then, if I even think about, let's say like Moonbeam, there's all these dependencies, right? So you need DEX liquidity in order to support like liquidations on like a lending and borrowing protocol like Moonwell. So then they like become constrained and aren't able to operate. And then there's like, there's all these kind of like the spider web of dependencies, which I feel like there is a possibility of some like negative, like, flywheel where there's like a concentration of things like into this, this like in the quote, in the core protocol, like state run system, but like, there's a kind of a negative effect like on, on the parachains. And the question is how does one guard against that? Because presumably like, obviously like that's not helpful to like the ecosystem as a whole if something like that happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of it does come down to synchrony versus asynchrony, right? Like, if you do have users coming into the system, right, with some small amount of DOT, and I'm not talking at the same time as someone. I'm not hearing anything, but I'm seeing the lines from Jakob. If someone's coming in with, say, a small amount of tokens, like, should they need to, say, send several XCM messages to several different parachains, right? Or should that be an operation that even requires XCM? I remember in the early days talking with, even 0x, like 4 years ago, they were raising the point that it probably makes most sense to actually have liquidity pools on almost every parachain and have whales auto balance between them, which is kind of a more efficient way of using the cross-chain messaging.
Sorry, what was the question? Like, there is definitely like interesting and potential design space in this, but I think like also like it would be like more beneficial open this discussion maybe as like research question and like fund it via grants programs or treasury or whatever, and let people and researchers compete with best possible solutions, except of like building notorious or like simple AMM, which has like a lot of trade-offs, and you won't be able to make people happy or make this useful by keeping it as it is, but you would like ended up in like process of like building full-fledged proper DEX, which is like trying to mitigate these trade-offs, because like if you let Statemint DEX in the wild, they're like it will be subject to toxic flow and all other like negative things around AMMs, which are like hard to solve anyway.
Yeah, but this is like exactly chain specialization. Like again, I mean, like it kind of sounds like you're saying that we should use the treasury to fund something that would be more competitive with other, like that would be more optimized for other situations. And like I think like the goals here is like there's a couple concrete goals, and the DEX shouldn't be like, it shouldn't compete for all these different use cases. And like I know you mentioned like UX and onboarding stuff, and like and these are like great priorities for different chains to specialize in, but like the system chains are optimized for security. So it sounds, yeah, okay, we can use an oracle or like a centralized exchange to get the price of Bitcoin, but like I don't think we want to trust an oracle like that from a system chain. So like I don't think like a DEX on statements can compete for user experience, and I don't think it's going to try to. So I think this is like a perfect case for other parachains to specialize and outperform in certain areas.
2 quick points. At first, I said that Interlay is already having this like Oracle functionality because it's necessary for them. So they are already getting price feed, which is like secured by security of Interlay and whatever security mechanisms which they have for this. So like you could already support ecosystem project for the onboarding Bitcoin users and Bitcoin holders with the functionality of already existing Parachain. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I didn't say that we should fund competitive DEX from Treasury. I said like if there is some like big technical challenge like synchronicity in cross-chain ecosystem, like let's do like proper big well-funded research for it, which will improve the whole ecosystem. And there is like very powerful, or like one of the most exciting feature on the Polkadot roadmap is like a little bit more or less related to it, and it's spree. So the question should be like, how is going development and research of the spree, and how we can accelerate it as a like whole community, and how we can attract the best researchers and engineers to help us ship spree better.
Yeah, that's fair, but like they're also not mutually exclusive, right? Like just to kick off and fund a research program and then conclude it and actually start implementing something and deploying it, like that takes several years. But I think like a lot of the challenges we're facing now can be alleviated with a DEX on statement, even a very simple one, right? So like we could have a DEX on statement, and we could also kick off this research project and try to come up with like better primitives for the whole ecosystem to use. Like I actually think that's a really good idea. Like we should be doing that, but I don't think it really has any kind of like bearing on whether or not there should be a DEX on statement in like the next 6 months.
Before we go any deeper, we are running up on the hour, so we're going to look to close this out. I'll give everybody the chance to make some concluding remarks. It was an interesting debate, got fairly heated now towards the end. It's unfortunate to not be able to dive that much deeper into it. But yeah, I'll hand it back over, let's say, to Jakob in the heat of the conversation to make some kind of closing remark.
Thanks for the word. So I would like to make it clear that like we believe that DEX on statement can be actually like very useful, can be practical. Actually, AMMs are great for such use case of like enabling paying fees in any tokens, while we are doing it in like much dummy way. We are just basically accepting other assets as a fees. On the other hand, like we believe is like it can lead to many like unintended consequences and a lot of like weird dynamics within and even like outside of the community, which we can like avoid by maybe more elegant and more simpler solution. So that's my 2 cents, and like I think like it's really worth to continue in this discussion. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, there is maybe an opportunity for a part 2. Yeah, Derek, any closing remarks?
No, I think this is a good discussion. I think that, like I said, some of the points even for me are somewhat clarified even in this discussion here. So I do think that there's probably an opportunity to just maybe even publish something about like goals, non-goals, and other things that were discussed even here today to help clarify for things, and that could protect even against some of the feature creep or other scenarios that should be avoided. Could be you could guard against those by just kind of being clear about what the goals of the project are. So yeah, that would be one thing I would say is a tangible takeaway, as a suggestion. Could be helpful. Because I think there is still confusion on some of those points from folks I've been talking to.
Lucas.
Yeah, I think so. My so actually 3 years ago at Polkadot Decoded, I talked about the biggest driver for adoption of Ethereum was the ERC20 token and how easy of a standard it was to interoperate. And I think a lot of the challenges we talk about here actually come back to exactly this, that within Polkadot we haven't figured out how to make this insanely scalable but technically very complex architecture of a really sharded chain with asynchronous communication, right? With like accounts on different chains, different gas tokens, right? Like all these things, how we actually abstract this away. I think in the early days of Ethereum, when you look at it, of DeFi on Ethereum, when you look at it, like a lot of people had similar struggles, maybe not exactly the same, definitely not the asynchronicity, but I do think there's a fair amount of like learning from there that ultimately comes back to like what we're discussing here, this DEX, right? Like it's mostly solving a UX issue for, it's trying to solve the UX issue for users that are onboarding into crypto. And maybe that is the right way to do it. I do think it's maybe short-term the easiest way to do it. And maybe that's why for the ecosystem as a whole, I think it will bring Polkadot forward the fastest. But let's not forget that we still have to do all this other work of just like actually making cross-chain interoperability as seamless as me clicking around on MetaMask today on Ethereum, right? And that is something where we need to have the researchers and the grants and development that Jakob, you were mentioning.
Cool. Joe?
Yeah, things got a bit heated, but I think conflict is actually good and helps actually come to agreement and move forward. I know I learned a lot from this and talking with you guys. I think especially like Jakob's idea about like funding like a research group to go work on more like asynchronous standards and ways to deal with some of these like cross-chain problems that we have is a really good idea, especially like the timing is perfect with kind of being on the verge of XCM v3. That's going to be a major improvement. I've played around with it a little bit, and I know it makes a lot of implementing other stuff much easier. So I hope that we've gone from like v0 to v3 in like just over a year. So it's been a lot of breaking changes, but with v3 coming out and a lot of the stuff that we've learned over the last year applied to v3, I think it's the perfect time to start working on like a longer term solution. And yeah, I actually hope that actually gets kicked off and somebody can work on that.
Yeah, thank you. I do agree. That's one of the main points even behind this space is that healthy conflict in a way that is done in the open is quite important for the ecosystem. It seems like there is some space to continue this conversation. Some work needs to be done, I think, before any much more meaningful conclusions could be drawn. But I'll close it out now. And thanks for joining everybody who came and spoke. Thanks for joining everybody who came to listen. Have a good day.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, man.